In the last video, I talked about independent and dependent variables and how variables measure the qualities or characteristics that you're interested in studying. Now let's get down to the specifics of how that measurement actually works. And some of this may seem a little dry or a little academic, but it becomes very important when it is time to design a survey, for example, and craft survey questions, which each of you will be doing. You need to understand what it is you're measuring and what is the best way to go about measuring that so that you can get actual meaningful results to your survey. So when we talk about measurement, there are 4 different levels of measurement. And one way to help think about this is to think about film noir, N-O-I-R. I don't know if any of you are fans of film noir, those sort of gritty, stylish crime detective dramas from the 1930s and 40s and 50s. But that word N-O-I-R can help you remember the 4 levels of measurement because each letter stands for one of those levels. The N for nominal, the O for ordinal, the I for interval, the R for ratio. And they go in order. So nominal at the bottom is the least precise of the 4 levels of measurement. Then we move up a step to ordinal measurement, and then to interval measurement, and then finally to ratio, which is the most precise of the 4 levels. So let's take a look at each of those levels one by one and what they mean, and then we'll talk about why all of this matters, why you should care. So we're going to start with the least precise of all, which is nominal measurement. And when I say nominal measurement and I describe it, you may be thinking, well, that doesn't even really sound like measurement to me. And that's because it is the least precise of the 4 levels. So nominal measurement is simply about taking people or taking items and putting them into categories. Okay? And then you may use a number to represent each of those categories. So for example, you can categorize people by gender, female, male, or non-binary. And you could assign a number to each of those categories, 1, 2, or 3. But that number isn't really a number, right? It's just a label. Like we wouldn't say someone who is non-binary has 3 times as much gender as someone who is female. That doesn't even make sense. The numbers are simply functioning as labels for our categories. Or to give you another example, if you were doing a study that involved looking at TV genres like sitcoms, dramas, reality shows, etc. Each of those categories might be assigned a number, but at the end of the day, they're just categories. That's nominal measurement. Not very precise. Okay, so let's move up a level. The next level after nominal is ordinal. Now, the word ordinal comes from the word order, ordinal. If you can associate those together, then you will remember that ordinal measurement is when you are rank ordering things. So there is some kind of a sequence or a progression, like first place, second place, third place, 4th place. Or to think about the Olympics as an example, you have the bronze medal, the silver medal, and the gold medal, right? There is an order or a sequence to those. We know that the athlete who wins the gold did better than the athlete who won the silver, did better than the athlete who won the bronze. But we don't know how much better, right? The difference between gold and silver may be 1/100th of a second, or it may be 10 seconds. We don't know the degree of difference, but we know there is a difference. We know that one thing is greater than another is greater than another. Similar story with academic standing. Freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, or grad student. We know that someone who's a grad student has completed more education than someone who is a senior or a junior, but we don't necessarily know exactly how much more, how many more credits, or how many more years, but we know it's more. We know that there is a sequence or an order to it. So that's ordinal measurement. Now let's move up one more level to interval measurement. When we get to interval measurement, things change a little bit because now we have a real scale, a scale of equal units or equal increments. But when we talk about interval measurement, there is no true zero for that scale, meaning the scale does not start at zero. The classic example of an interval scale is temperature. Temperature is measured in degrees. Degrees are equal units or equal increments. The difference between 71 and 72 degrees is the same as the difference between 72 and 73. Those are equal increments. But temperature does not start at zero because it can go below zero. So that's an example of an interval scale. Now you might be saying, why the big fuss over whether or not the scale starts at zero? It may seem like a rather trivial matter, but when it comes time to run statistical tests to actually test your hypothesis or answer your research question, this becomes important because a lot of statistical tests will freak out if you don't have a scale that starts at zero. So that's where this becomes a big deal. When we design survey questions, we often use what is called a Likert scale that goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and it's often a scale of 1 to 5. I'm going to talk more about Likert scales in just a minute, but this is an example of an interval scale because we assume that these are equal increments. However, the scale does not start at 0, it starts at 1. So Likert scales are an example of interval measurement. Okay, let's move up to the most precise of them all, which is ratio. And ratio measurement is where you have a scale of equal units, only this time the scale does indeed start at 0. So there's all kinds of examples of this, like someone's age in years. When someone is born, they are age 0, and then each year you tack on another year. Height, income, distance, time spent using the internet. Those are all examples of ratio measurement. So those are the 4 levels. And the question, of course, is, so what? Why does any of this matter? Well, it matters because when it comes time to design survey questions or other, this also applies to some other quantitative methods as well besides surveys, you want to make sure that you are using the most precise level of measurement that is practical. So you don't want to use nominal measurement if you can do better than that. Sometimes you can't do better than that. If you are studying something like gender, you may be stuck with nominal measurement, male, female, non-binary. You can't get more precise than that. But for a lot of the kinds of things we like to measure, we can get more precise. So you want to get more precise if that's possible. You want to try to use interval or ratio scales wherever possible, which allows you to run more powerful statistical tests. And at the end of the day, it gives you more meaningful results so that all of your work is not in vain. So let me show you some examples of this at work. Let's say you are a researcher posing this hypothesis. Internet use is associated with a drop in academic performance. So there are 2 variables there, an independent variable, which is the cause, which would be internet use, and a dependent variable, academic performance. So you would want to make sure that if you were doing this in the form of a survey, that you had at least one question for each of those variables. So you might be tempted to ask questions like what you see listed on the slide. Do you use the internet a lot? Yes or no? Do you get good grades? Yes or no? And say, there you go. That's how I'm going to measure those 2 variables. What level of measurement would that be? Look at what you're doing. You're taking people, you're putting them into either yes categories or no categories. So that's categorizing. That's nominal measurement. That's the weakest form of measurement. And when it came time for you to analyze your results, this is about all you could do. You would end up with 4 categories based on whether they use the internet a lot or not, and whether they have good grades or bad grades. All you'd be able to do is say how many people fell into each of those 4 categories. Not terribly precise or terribly meaningful. So you want to ask yourself, can I do better? Can I use questions that will give me a higher level of measurement? And the answer is yes, you can. You could ask your survey respondents, how many hours per week do you use the internet? You can also ask them, what is your GPA? What level of measurement would those questions give you? Well, they would give you ratio measurement, because hours per week, if they don't use the internet at all, they would say 0. And then it would be a scale of equal increments, hours. Similar story for GPA. The GPA scale starts at 0, goes up to 4.0. So you would now be asking 2 ratio level questions instead of nominal level questions. And when it came time for you to run your results, you would have something like this, probably in the form of a spreadsheet. For each respondent, you would have how many hours per week they spend on the internet, and you would have their GPA. And you would be able to run much more powerful statistical tests, like a correlation test. And at the end of the day, you would be able to say something like, for each hour someone spends on the internet, their GPA drops so many points, or goes up by so many points. So it would give you much more precise data. Let me talk about one more thing, which is measurement scales. All of us have taken surveys, so you've seen these kinds of measurement scales before, even if you didn't know the technical name for them. So Likert and semantic differential scales are 2 of the most common measurement scales used in communication research. So remember what we said, simple yes/no questions are weak. So if you wanted to find out whether people believe that public relations professionals serve the public interest, you might be tempted to pose it as a simple yes/no question. Well, that's only going to give you simple yes/no data, which is nominal data, which is not terribly precise. So again, we ask the question, can you do better than this? And the answer is yes, you can. So you might instead pose it as a Likert scale question. So what is a Likert scale? I believe it is named after the person who invented the scale. It is when you give people a simple statement or a series of statements in the form of a declarative sentence, and then they have to rate their level of agreement on a scale that goes from strongly disagree on one end to strongly agree on the other end. And it's usually a 5-point scale. Sometimes it's a 7-point scale, but it's generally an odd number because we want to include a neutral category in the middle. Some people will want to select a neutral option. So this is an example of the Likert scale. Now notice it is a scale that starts at 1. It does not start at 0. And then it goes up in increments 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is an example of interval measurement. Another type of scale that is very similar, but slightly different, so it has a different name, is a semantic differential scale. So what is that? So with a semantic differential scale, you pose a question, such as, what are your impressions of public relations professionals? And then you give respondents a series of opposites, bipolar adjectives. And you put one word on one side, the opposite word on the other side, and then they have to indicate by checking a box or a blank where their opinion falls on that spectrum. So you might have good versus bad, smart versus stupid, honest versus dishonest. The adjectives would obviously vary depending on what kind of question you're asking, but you want to make sure that they are opposites. If they're not opposites, it doesn't work. So once again, this would be a Likert, once again, this would be a semantic differential scale, but it would be an interval level of measurement. Because even though we don't see numbers here, we would assign a number to each of these, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So once again, it would be interval measurement. Now, whenever possible, you want to borrow measurement scales from previous studies rather than creating your own from scratch. Why is that? Well, for one thing, it makes your life easier, but there's a couple of other reasons why. If you use existing scales that have been used before by previous researchers, you know that those scales will be reliable because they've already been used, they've already been tested and shown to be reliable. Also, it means that you can easily compare your results with results of the previous studies because you both measured things the same way. If you measure stuff differently, it's going to be hard to compare your results with the previous studies because it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. The other thing to understand is that usually we don't measure a variable with a single question. Instead, we tend to use what is called an index that is made up of several questions or several items. And all of those items together, when summed up, give us the measurement for that variable. Let me show you an example of how that works. Let's say you were doing a study and you wanted to measure people's attitudes toward shopping websites. So you would ask yourself, has this already been studied? Have people measured this before? Is there an existing scale? And it turns out there is. These researchers named Chen and Wells, way back in 1999, developed a scale for measuring attitude toward the site. And it is an index of 5 items, 5 Likert scale items. So for each of these statements, people would have to rate their level of agreement on a scale of 1 to 5. And then what you would do is you would add up their responses. So if they said 5, 4, 3, 5, 4, you add up those numbers and you end up with a total of 21. So their attitude towards the site equals 21. If they had marked all 1s, their attitude toward the site would be 5. And if they had marked all 5s, their attitude towards the site would be 25. So you have now created a 5-item index that measures attitude toward the site on a scale of 5 to 25. Very precise, gives you very interesting and meaningful data. When we talk about constructing surveys, you will put all of this stuff to use when you create those survey questions.